There is a moment most people cannot name. It arrives quietly. No dramatic scene, no confrontation. Just a shift. Something almost imperceptible, like the air pressure changing right before a storm that has been building for months. You are sitting across from someone you have given everything to, and something inside you goes still. Not numb. Not broken. Still. And in that stillness, you finally see what has been in front of you the whole time. You see the machinery, the structure, the architecture of how this relationship was built and what it was built to extract from you. And the person on the other side of that table, the one who has held so much power over your nervous system for so long, feels it happen. They can feel the ground shifting beneath their feet even when nothing on the surface has changed. That is what this video is about. That specific, irreversible moment when the empath stops performing blindness and begins to see with surgical clarity. And what happens to the narcissist when they realize the source has finally learned to read the code. I want to start with something that research has consistently confirmed, not in the language of spiritual pop psychology, but in hard observational terms. Studies on individuals with high narcissistic traits have found that their apparent lack of empathy is not primarily a cognitive incapacity. They can, in many cases, recognize what another person is feeling. The issue, as the research literature describes it, is motivation. The lack of care is not an inability to perceive. It is a choice not to be bothered by what is perceived. That distinction matters enormously because it means the relationship was never built on a misunderstanding. It was built on a deliberate asymmetry, one person offering everything they had to someone who chose, at a fundamental level, not to extend the same. Now let me name what you have been carrying, because it needs to be named with precision, not swept under words like sad or confused. What most people in this situation feel is a very specific kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has spent months or years translating themselves into a language another person would never learn. It is the tiredness of constant self-contortion. You enter a room and before you have said a word, your nervous system is already reading the temperature, calibrating your response, adjusting your needs downward and your availability upward. And what makes this exhaustion almost impossible to explain to anyone outside the dynamic is that it lives in the body before it reaches the mind. It shows up as a tension in the jaw that you do not notice until days after the conversation. As a slightly held breath. As the specific way your shoulders drop 2 inches when you realize the person you have been dreading to disappoint is not going to call tonight. That exhaustion did not begin with this relationship. The research on attachment and early developmental patterns is clear on this. When a child grows up in an environment where love is conditional, where affection arrives unpredictably and must be earned through vigilance and self-erasure, the nervous system is trained to organize itself around managing another person's emotional state. Hypervigilance to emotional cues, constant monitoring, a compulsive orientation toward the other. This pattern gets installed at a neurobiological level long before anyone has the language to describe it. And by the time you meet someone whose emotional structure precisely mirrors the childhood dynamic that shaped you, the pull is not romantic. It is ancient. It is the nervous system recognizing a familiar template and mistaking recognition for connection. That is the first thing Jung's work in Memoirs, Dreams, Reflections helped me understand about my own history with this kind of dynamic. He writes about how we carry the wounds of the first relational failures inside us, not as memories exactly, but as organizing structures, patterns the psyche returns to, because they feel like home even when home was a place of pain. Within the framework of analytical psychology, what draws these two particular psychic structures together is not accident. It is the unconscious seeking completion. The person who was trained to lose themselves in service of another's emotional world finds the person who requires exactly that. And the first phase of the encounter feels like discovery, like finally being seen. Because in those early weeks, someone with high narcissistic traits is studying you with a precision that feels like intimacy. They are reading your needs, your sensitivities, your thresholds, your fears. But they are not reading you to understand you. They are reading you to map you. And the distinction between being understood and being mapped only becomes visible much later when the map starts being used against you. Most content about this topic will stop there. It will tell you that you were targeted because of your sensitivity, that you were chosen because of your wounds, that you should have recognized the red flags earlier. I do not dismiss any of that. There is truth in it. But it is the obvious read. And the obvious read is incomplete, because what it misses is the specific question that actually changes everything. Not what did this person do to me, but what in me made this feel like love. What part of my inner structure was so hungry for this particular kind of intensity that I organized my life around someone who was never fully available to me? In my years of sitting with Jung's work, particularly in Os Arquetipos e o Inconsciente Coletivo, the concept of the complex is what clarified this for me more than anything else. Jung described complexes as autonomous emotional clusters living in the unconscious, charged constellations of memory, feeling, and expectation that behave like separate personalities within the psyche. And the complex at the center of this dynamic for the highly empathic person is almost always organized around a fundamental wound. The wound of having had to earn love, having had to disappear to be accepted, having had to be useful to be valued. The narcissistic partner did not create that wound. The narcissistic partner activated it, walked directly into it. And the wound, recognizing the match, mistook the pain of activation for the heat of real connection. This is where I want to stop and ask you something directly. Have you ever noticed that the moments in this relationship that felt most intense, most alive, were almost always the moments of relief after threat? The warmth after a cold spell, the tenderness after an absence, the brief, luminous window of closeness after a conflict that left you shaking. What the research on trauma bonding has established is that this specific pattern is neurochemically compelling in a way that has nothing to do with the other person's worth or your judgment. When intermittent reinforcement is applied by someone who controls access to relief from their own threatening behavior, the brain produces responses that are measurable and consistent across populations. The unpredictability drives the bonding. The cruelty makes the kindness feel like rescue. The nervous system, trained since childhood to work hard for connection, throws its full biological resources into maintaining the bond. This is not weakness. This is a predictable response of a nervous system following the pattern it was built to follow. Understanding this does not dissolve the bond, but it relocates the origin. It stops being a story about your failure of discernment and becomes a story about a pattern that was installed long before you were old enough to choose. If any of this is landing somewhere real, I want to ask you to leave a comment below with just 3 words: I finally see. Not for me. For the person who is going to scroll through these comments at 2 in the morning, wondering if anyone else has felt this, and who will see your 3 words and feel slightly less alone in what they are carrying. Now I need to make a concession that most channels in this space refuse to make, because it is not comfortable. There is a reading of the empath and narcissist dynamic that positions the empath as pure victim and the narcissist as pure predator. And I understand why that framing is appealing. It is clean, it is morally organized, it offers the relief of a clear villain, and the villain is real. What happens in these relationships is genuinely harmful. I will not minimize that. But the framing of pure victim and pure predator is incomplete in a way that actually slows down healing rather than accelerating it. Because it keeps the empath's gaze permanently fixed on the other person, and as long as the gaze is fixed outward, the inner work cannot begin. Jung spent years, particularly after the rupture with Freud in the early 1910s, insisting on a principle that the psychoanalytic establishment of his time found intolerable: that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed wishes and childhood trauma. It is an active, dynamic system that shapes our choices, our attractions, and our repetitions in ways that conscious intention cannot override. His colleagues ridiculed him for it. He lost relationships, institutional standing, and the regard of people he had considered allies. But he refused to reduce the complexity of the inner world to a model that made people more comfortable. And what he kept insisting on was this: what we experience repeatedly is not bad luck. It is the unconscious returning us to unfinished business, which means that the most powerful question is not how do I escape this person? It is what in me keeps choosing this encounter. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Understanding this does not mean you caused what was done to you. It does not mean the harm you experienced was your fault. What it means is that genuine liberation requires looking at both sides of the dynamic with honesty, the external force that shaped the situation and the internal structure that made you available for it. Here is the talk point that most people feel but cannot name. There comes a phase in this kind of relationship where the empath begins to develop capacities that were never there before. A precision of perception, an ability to read motivations beneath surface behavior, an almost eerie attunement to the difference between what is being said and what is actually happening. The body starts registering information before the mind processes it. There is a tightening somewhere when a specific tone of voice enters the room, a recognition in the gut when a compliment is shaped a certain way. The empath who has been studying someone who never told the truth starts to develop something that might be called fluency in the language of concealment. And here the Jungian shadow work becomes urgent in a way that is uncomfortable to sit with, because there is a danger that arrives with this new fluency. And it is the danger Jung described when he talked about the risk of identifying with the shadow you have been forced to map. When you learn someone's mechanisms of control thoroughly enough, when you understand exactly where the pressure points are and how the system operates, there is a temptation, a quiet, almost rational feeling temptation to use what you have learned, to create distance as punishment, to deploy silence strategically, to manage access the way access was managed to you. And if this resonates, I am not asking you to condemn yourself for it. I am asking you to look at it with curiosity rather than either justification or shame. Because if you find yourself reaching for the tools that were used against you, the question worth sitting with is this: am I protecting myself, or am I becoming fluent in a language I swore I would never speak? The shadow does not care about our intentions. It works through them. I want to pause here and say something honest about the limits of everything I've just offered you. Knowing the architecture of this dynamic does not erase the physical reality of what you are carrying right now. Understanding that your nervous system was trained since childhood to seek love through self-erasure does not silence the specific loneliness of tonight. Recognizing the Jungian concept of the complex does not make the body stop searching for the person it was chemically bonded to. I am not selling you insight as cure. The insight is real and it is worth having, but the road is longer than any video can cover, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something that does not exist. What does shift is the relationship to the experience itself, not the presence of the pain, the meaning you carry alongside it. In my reading of Jung's work, and I have been sitting with it for a long time now, particularly the material in Ion, where he goes deep into the structure of the self and the forces that resist individuation, the function of suffering that is held with consciousness is different from the function of suffering that is merely endured. When you begin to see what the pain is pointing at, when you understand the wound it is tracing, something changes in the quality of the experience. It does not disappear, but it begins to mean something other than evidence of your own inadequacy. If this channel is where you have been coming to sit with these questions, I want to invite you to stay. Subscribe now, not because it costs you anything, but because the work this channel is committed to is not the surface version of these conversations. It is the version that goes underneath the platitudes, into the actual structure of the psyche, into what Jung spent his entire professional life pointing at before and after the institutions tried to bury his work. This is a space for people who are serious about the inner life, and if that is why you came here, you belong here. Now I want to talk about what actually happens in the specific moment that gives this video its title, because it is not what most people expect. The moment the empath begins to see through the system is not a moment of triumph. It is not the empowering confrontation that most people imagine when they think about finally recognizing manipulation. It is quieter than that, and stranger. What happens is that a certain quality of reactivity leaves the body. The empath stops rising to the hooks, not because they have hardened, not because they have built a wall, but because something that was previously unconscious is now conscious. And consciousness changes the phenomenology of the experience completely. When you understand the mechanism loses a specific kind of traction. Not all traction, but the traction that operated through your blind spots. And this is precisely where the narcissist begins to feel something they are not equipped to process. Because the entire relational system that was built depended on a particular quality of availability in the other person. It depended on reactivity, on the predictable emotional responses that could be managed, calibrated and used to generate the supply that the narcissist's inner structure requires. When that reactivity goes quiet, when the empath becomes present but not accessible in the old way, the system encounters something it does not have a protocol for. And what follows is often described by people who have lived through it as one of the most disorienting phases of the entire relationship. Because the narcissist does not simply accept the change, they escalate. They reach back into the archive of what worked before, the charm sequence, the vulnerability performance, the promise of the version of themselves that only ever appeared when control was at risk. And the empath, watching all of this with the new clarity, experiences something they may not have expected, not satisfaction, not relief, something closer to a deep, quiet sadness. Because what they see is not a monster. What they see is someone trapped inside a structure that is as old and as limiting as the structure the empath has been living inside themselves. Two people, each imprisoned by patterns installed long before they met each other, each playing out a dynamic that was already in motion before the relationship began. Here is a distinction I want to draw carefully, because I think it matters. There is a difference between seeing through someone and seeing past them. Seeing through someone is the first movement. It is the clarity that arrives when the mechanisms are finally visible. It is necessary, but it can calcify into contempt if it stops there. And contempt is its own form of imprisonment because it keeps the other person at the center of your interior life, which is exactly where they were when the dynamic was at its most consuming. Seeing past someone is the second movement. It is when the empath's gaze moves through the clarity about the other person and lands, finally, on themselves. On the question of who they are when they are not organizing themselves around someone else's requirements. What they want when the wanting is not filtered through another person's approval. What their body feels like when it is not in a permanent state of readiness to manage someone else's emotional weather. In the tradition of analytical psychology, this movement is what individuation actually means at the experiential level. Not becoming enlightened, not achieving some final state of integration, but beginning to live from a center that belongs to you, rather than from a periphery that was shaped by someone else's needs. Jung endured something that I think illuminates this distinction in a way that is worth naming. After the rupture with Freud, during the years between roughly 1913 and 1919, Jung entered what he himself described as a period of profound disorientation. He had lost his mentor, his institutional standing, and the certainty of his own professional identity. He was, in a real sense, cast out, and what he did during that period was not immediately visible to the world. He descended deliberately into the material that would eventually become the Liber Novus, the Red Book, which his family kept from public view for nearly a century. He did the opposite of what his critics expected. He did not harden. He did not build a wall. He went deeper into the unknown interior and began the work of learning to listen to what was there. That work, that willingness to enter the disorientation rather than manage it, is what produced everything of lasting value that he left behind. The institutions that dismissed him were, in many ways, the forces that made the depth of that work possible, because they removed the option of staying comfortable at the surface. There is something in that for anyone sitting with this particular kind of loss right now. The relationship that shattered you was also the relationship that broke open something that needed to be broken open. That is not gratitude for the harm. It is recognition that the most significant interior openings often arrive through the most unwelcome doors. I want to share with you a specific thing that tends to happen in the nervous system during this phase of emergence, because it is important to understand and easy to misread. The body, as it begins to release the chronic vigilance state that the relationship required, does not immediately feel like relief. It often feels like absence, like something is wrong because nothing is threatening right now. The hypervigilance that protected you also organized you. It gave the nervous system a constant project, a constant orientation. When that organizing threat is removed, the system can feel unmoored in a way that gets misread as grief for the other person, when what it actually is the body recalibrating to a baseline of safety it has not experienced in a long time, and perhaps has never fully experienced at all. If there is someone in your life right now who is moving through what you recognize in this video, the most important thing you can do is not explain it to them. Not send them this video with a note saying, "I told you so." What you can do is stay. Be one of the people who does not make their availability conditional. That is, quietly and without drama, one of the most powerful things one person can do for another. If you feel moved to do that for someone today, share this video with them. Not as a lecture, as a presence. If this channel has become a place where something in you recognizes itself, I want to ask you to subscribe before this video ends. We are building something here that is less interested in simple answers than in serious questions. If you have made it this far in this conversation, you are exactly the kind of person this space exists for. The new version of the empath that emerges from this process is not the healed version that popular psychology likes to promise. It is something stranger and more sustainable than that. It is a person who has learned to tolerate their own company without organizing that company around someone else's needs, who has learned that sensitivity is not a liability to be managed, but a form of perception to be integrated with discernment, who has come to understand, slowly and not without grief, that the capacity to feel deeply is not the cause of what happened to them. The cause was a specific dynamic that fed on that capacity. And the distinction between the two is the difference between pathologizing the gift and learning how to carry it with protection. Jung would call this the beginning of the integration of the shadow, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing practice. The shadow here is not only the narcissist's hidden structure, it is everything in the empath that remained unconscious and therefore available to be used. The need that could not be named, the fear that could not be admitted, the hunger for intensity that mistook danger for depth. When those elements are brought into awareness, they do not disappear, but they stop operating through you without your knowledge. And that is, within the framework of analytical psychology, the most radical form of freedom available. Not freedom from difficulty, freedom from being driven by what you have not yet seen. There is a video that is going to appear on your screen in a moment. I did not make it lightly. I sat with it for a long time before deciding to publish it. Not everyone who watches this one will be ready for it. But if something in this conversation has shifted something in you, if you feel less like a person something happened to, and more like a person beginning to understand why, then what comes next was made for where you are right now. The screen will show it to you when this ends. I am not going to describe it. I trust that who needs it will know.